We don't speak about grief very much. It isn't part of our everyday conversation, which is why I'd like to start one and share my thoughts on grief and grieving in the hopes that they can offer some comfort and help anyone who's experiencing the loss of a two-legged or a four-legged loved one. Grief can show up at the most unexpected times, when we're at the supermarket, brushing our teeth, in the shower, in the middle of a good time, and hit us with such unexpected force, maybe because we don't have time to brace for the impact. But I think that even if we did, we would feel that pain just as much. We can assume that because we see the loss coming, that somehow we can prepare for it and use that to buffer the pain we feel when our loved one dies. But whether we see it coming or not, grief can hit us hard. Grief is such a complex emotion. And I think this is because, when we're grieving, we can feel so many feelings that all seemed rolled up into this one enormous feeling called grief. My perception of grief is that there's the feeling of grief itself, and then there's the grieving journey. I don't think there's any universal manual out there that can tell us how to grieve, because loss comes in so many different shapes and sizes. The instructions would have to change depending on who we are and how we feel about what we lost. Our grieving journey, I think, is an experience that is uniquely our own. So I don't believe we can tell anyone else what their journey should look like or feel like or how long it should last based on our own personal experience. There are some great books out there that have steps and models and can help if the information resonates and can help us to make sense of our loss. But what if we can't relate to what we're reading? What if our grief doesn't look like what's outlined? When our grief doesn't look like anybody else's, we can be tempted to ask, is my grief normal? Am I not grieving right? What I've come to understand is that there is no correct answer that can tell us how to grieve. So there's no such thing as getting it right or getting it wrong. But I do believe that we can make this journey a safe one when we can learn to offer some loving kindness, some compassion, and wise understanding to the part of us that's just trying to figure out this journey. Depending on the circumstances surrounding our loss, on the nature of the relationship that we lost, we can be feeling so many things. If I had to draw a picture of grief, it would look like a sphere with a big hole in it. And this hole would be filled with all those feelings. What can make grief so tricky to unravel, what can make being with our grief so challenging, are the feelings inside this sphere. Maybe it's shock, anger, guilt, hate, regret, betrayal, overwhelm. These feelings don't have to be logical, and often they're not, but that doesn't make them any less real or painful. How heavy that sphere is, what that hole contains, can be different for each one of us. But I think that what we do share in common is the feeling that we're about to fall into that hole. I think that when we learn to grieve mindfully, our very awareness, our very mindfulness can prevent that from happening. I think that when we can experience our grief mindfully with kindness, patience, respect, compassion, and wisdom, we can eventually arrive at a place of peaceful acceptance. I think that grief simply asks us to observe it from a place and a space inside of us where it can be honored and understood, not feared or resisted or ignored. Now, observing our grief isn't about monitoring our grief, about policing it so it doesn't misbehave. Mindfulness doesn't pressure our grief to hurry up and leave because it's about non-striving. It can help us to perceive our grief differently, not as an emotional state that we need to solve quickly so we can get on with our life. But it can help remind us that when we make the goal about getting to the finish line, about getting over our sense of loss, about getting over the missing, then the goal can add to our suffering when we realize that the finish line may never appear. We can gain so much if we just observe our sorrow and everything else that is inside our grief and accept the what is. Accept the weight of our grief without striving either to get rid of it or to hold on to it. I think that observing our grief is about observing it as it fills our heart, as it fills our thoughts, as it fills our body. I don't think that sitting with our grief is about fueling or growing those thoughts, those sensations, but about allowing them to show up, to find their expression, and then gently flow out. Our quiet observation can help us to notice when we're holding on too tightly to our grief and allow our heart, our mind, our body to gently ease their grip. I think that grief is a beautiful emotion that ought to be allowed its freedom to come and to go. I think it's perfectly okay for us to fluctuate, to go from a moment of deep grief to a moment of deep peace, to go from a moment of peace to a moment of violent sorrow, to go from a moment of deep missing to a moment of deep thankfulness, to go from a moment of yearning to a moment of calm, and then go back from that moment of calm to that moment of yearning. I think that mindful grieving is about telling ourselves, I'm going to be with my grief, my sadness, my longing, with all the feelings that are inside my grief, wholeheartedly, even though my heart feels less than whole. And then to give my grief permission to move in and out of me. The wise observer in us doesn't criticize or judge our grief. Observing it isn't about trying to fix it or change how it feels. Mindfulness has no agenda other than to remind us to pay wise attention to the part of us that is grieving and offer it love and tender compassion. There's so much fragile beauty in just allowing ourselves to stand, to sit, to lie with our grief. And even when we think we won't be able to do that and breathe at the same time, as each minute, hour, day, week, month, year passes, we learn that we can. Numbing, avoiding the part of us that feels grief doesn't make us feel better, because the part of us that yearns needs to be given the freedom to express that yearning, the sadness for what we lost, for the future that we hoped for and expected with our loved one that will never come. But how do we be with our yearning without drowning in it? How do we honor our grief without becoming it? Without becoming deaf and blind to everything inside of us and around us that isn't that grief and longing. I think that when we learn to grieve a little more mindfully, we can feel however we feel, but lose ourselves perhaps a little less in the sorrow, the yearning, the wishing. I think that grief, if left to its own devices, left to become mindless grieving, can blind our perception and make us lose sight of all our blessings, the big ones, the small ones, lose sight of everything that we didn't lose, of the gift of the ordinary but so extraordinary, precious moment. I think that grief can feel so all-consuming, perhaps because the part of us that grieves may believe that the only right thing to do is to feel grief all the time, night and day. But is this pace sustainable? Were our bodies created to withstand the unrelenting weight and pressure of our grief and all the feelings inside of it? Our brain may want us to fixate on thoughts of our loss, but our mind, our body may need a moment of freedom from our suffering. We can feel guilty about spending an afternoon free of grief, or feel guilty about having a good time when someone we love just died, or we can judge others harshly for doing that. In the face of overwhelming loss, the part of us that grieves can consider it inappropriate to allow ourselves to feel anything but grief and all those feelings inside of it. It happens that grief can become very reluctant to share that vast emotional space inside of us. But I think that, the part of us that grieves could learn and benefit from opening its heart to the idea that grief is happier when it learns to share that space with other lighter emotions. Mindfulness is what grows that awareness that keeps reminding us that if we don't make room for a little lightheartedness in the present moment, grief will take that moment from us. And it's also the awareness that reminds us that if grief does do that, then that's perfectly fine too. The wise observer in us is what can allow us to stay mindful, that we don't allow that deep sense of loss to shut out the potential for a little relaxation, a little peace, a little pleasure, a little appreciation. Being mindful is about listening to that voice that says it's okay to invite these feelings into our heart, to keep our sadness and yearning company. They make for very good companions. We can somehow feel that we're betraying our grief if we allow ourselves to forget about it for a little while. But I don't think there's anything wrong with using the present moment to take a break from our grieving. We can call this time out a distraction. But when we do it mindfully and not mindlessly, it carries the force of purpose and wise intention. Pushing a pause button on grief at the appropriate time can make room in our life for the potential and possibility of other experiences, other lighter emotions. And when we give ourselves permission to welcome the present moment, not with grief, but with a little contentment, it doesn't mean we're being disloyal to our grief. It just means we're being mindful about not missing an opportunity to celebrate the present moment, to celebrate a wedding, to celebrate a beautiful sunset, to celebrate a good meal in good company, to celebrate the fact that we're still breathing. I think that when we lose someone we love, it becomes about learning to intuit if, when, and for how long to push the pause button on our grief, and when and for how long to allow ourselves the freedom to fall apart and grieve. I think that when we stay connected, mindful of the wise observer in us, we can stay more deeply connected with the intuitive navigational system that helps us to know when to give in to our grief and weep so that our heart, our liver, our organs don't have to do it for us. And when it's time to allow ourselves a respite from the crying. I believe that connecting with that divine awareness in us that is greater than even the vastness of our grief can help guide us, can help us to navigate that fine line between allowing ourselves to sit with our grief and to observe when we've sat for long enough and it's time to shift our focus from the future that loss took away to the beautiful blessings and memories that we can use to buffer the pain of our loss and create a new future in the present moment. My mother passed the day before Thanksgiving in 2021. One day, the wise observer in me made me ask myself, am I clinging to my grief or is my grief clinging to me? This question and working out the answer have really helped me to grieve more mindfully. I realize that grief may not always want it, but happiness also has a right to live in my heart. For me, my feelings are like my children, and I have this picture in my head of all these feelings raising their hands eagerly and saying, pick me, and grief just clinging to me, insisting that I paid attention and ignore all the others. When I feel grief crowding out my ability to feel anything but that, I'll connect with it in a loving way, in a way that feels gentle and kind and wise. And I'll speak to it. I'll say something like, I know you don't want me to feel happy now, but you need a little happy to keep you company. So I'm going to take you out to a movie with a good friend. Or I'll say something like, come keep me company while I relax and enjoy dinner out with my family. When I do this, these distractions become mindful because they carry a loving and compassionate intention. I think that connecting with our grief mindfully is about saying, look, I feel you, but I'm not betraying you if I also choose to honor the potential of this moment to bring me a little goodness, a little smile, a little comfort. Learning to do this can make the grieving journey feel more sustainable and less physically and emotionally exhausting. And I think that when we feel less depleted, it can become just a little easier to open our hearts wide enough to release some of the pain that's inside our grief. I believe that we honor our grief when we can learn to give it a good, comforting hug. Spending quiet time alone or out in nature, listening to another story of grief can feel like such comforting things. Or maybe spending a crazy day or a night out with friends can be just the thing to soothe that emotional ache and, help the part of us that is grieving to get some much needed rest. If we make our grief feel like an emotional prison that puts us behind bars, it can feel like something we want to escape from rather than something that we want to connect with and even embrace. I think that what can make grieving feel so hard is the history of our loss, the constant rumination that takes us to those coulda, shouldas, the feeling of not being able to go back and change anything. 2 words, if only, can fill our grief with so much regret. When a loved one dies, regret, blame can add a heavy layer of complexity and pain to our grief, to our sorrow and yearning. That futile wishing, if only I had been there, if only I had done things differently, can convince us that somehow it would all have made a difference, that our grief would now be easier to bear, or that we could have prevented a loved one from passing away. Accepting the not being there, the not doing things differently, can take a while. Working out that acceptance in our mind can be very challenging, but it's a natural part of the grieving process. But I think that learning to grieve mindfully is about reminding ourselves of the power of choice. We can choose to allow these if-onlys to punish us with regret for the rest of our life. But would this really honor who we lost and what we lost? Or is perhaps learning to make peace with the what was, with the what is, a more honest and helpful path? I think that when we can learn to observe the thoughts that make us feel regretful, that blame us, that make us feel guilty. With a little kindness, a little compassion and wisdom, we can learn to ask ourselves not whether these thoughts are true, but whether they're helpful or even appropriate. Learning to let go of the regret, the blame, the guilt is a choice that I believe our loved ones from wherever they are would wholeheartedly support. And I believe we can honor their memory and grow as human beings when we use our power to choose forgiveness and release some or all of the feelings that can make our grief feel like such a burden. The part of us that grieves needs to be allowed to grieve in peace. The question is, for how long? A year? A lifetime? When we begin this journey, we never know quite when it's going to end or even if it should end. A client once asked me, well, for how long should my grieving last? And my reply was this: only you can decide. And the answer is something that no one gets to judge, not even you. Moments of grief can come and go, but the grieving journey can last until we take our very last breath, depending on the impact of that missing, that longing on our very being. If we decide to make the journey a lifetime, well, then we might as well make the journey a mindful one. And it's good to get clear on what that means to you. It may seem like a contradiction in terms, but for me, the grieving journey is about not allowing grief to live my life for me. For me, the grieving journey is like taking a road trip, except that this road trip isn't exclusively meant for me and my grief. Oh, my grief can be my companion and sit next to me on many days, but there's plenty of room to welcome other lighter feelings to come along for the ride as well. When I observe the part of me that's grieving, wanting to play dictator and just rule my inner world, I'll observe it with wise understanding and a little loving kindness, and I will mindfully invite other feelings like contentment, like playfulness, to come and live my day for me. Forever is a long time, and I think it's important to pace ourselves for the sake of our emotional and physical health. Our body may want to weep forever, night and day, but the grief and the grieving can deplete and exhaust it. The hole in our heart that's filled with those intense, conflicting, confusing feelings may just be begging for us to fill it with a little peace, a little rest, a little happiness. If life becomes solely about experiencing that profound sense of loss, then we can end up losing our life to our grief. Now, if this is what we choose, this is what we choose. And we can honor the journey when we travel without judgment, with loving kindness and compassion for ourselves, for our journey, remembering that no grieving journey is better than another. They're all simply different experiences, different paths that we choose to travel. In the aftermath of profound loss, it can feel as though we can't move forward because all we want to do is go back and somehow undo that loss. But of course we can't do that, so we can end up feeling as though the grieving is holding us in place. And when others tell us we need to move on, that we're stuck in our grief, it can be challenging figuring out what that means. Does that mean we literally have to move? When should we move on? What should we move towards? And we can be left asking ourselves, do we have to move on at all? Do we have to say goodbye to our grief when all we want to do is be with it until, well, forever? Figuring out that moving on can take time and a lot of trial and error. Sometimes our misguided efforts to move on can backfire and we can end up right back where we started. Kind of like that children's board game, Chutes and Ladders. Just when we think we're coming out ahead and we're going to win, we can suddenly find ourselves right at the very start of the game. When the we becomes just you, figuring out that you, without that loved one, who you are, a parent without his child, a dog owner without his beloved companion, a partner without his mate, a sister without her sibling, can leave our brain bewildered, disoriented. This struggle to make sense of this new reality without them, to accept it, can seem interminable and leave us asking ourselves, when are we finally going to figure this out? When is our grieving going to end? If the grieving journey has a destination, then I would say that it isn't about arriving at a place where our deep sorrow and yearning are completely gone, but rather about arriving at a place of acceptance, accepting that we can live a full and happy life, even with grief in our hearts. For me, I think that getting to that place is about learning to greet a moment of grief and embrace the part of us that's grieving from a higher emotional awareness. From this higher perspective, then our grief can feel less intense, easier somehow, feel more comforted because it knows it's not alone. The part of us that's learned to understand it better, the different parts of us that love to go walking, biking, go to the movies, that love to dance or, just enjoy a night out with friends, are keeping our grief company. How long it takes us to arrive at this place, whether it's quickly or very gradually, in the eyes of this higher emotional awareness, is perfect. When we lose someone or something significant, our heart can break a little or a lot. So I think that the grieving journey becomes about searching for that magic glue that can help put our minutes, our days, weeks, and months back together into something that resembles a new normal. Our brain, as good as it is about predicting us, can't always predict how, when, or where we're going to find that magic glue. And even the thought of finally finding it can make us sad, because even when we manage to piece our heart back together again, we know it's not the same. We're not the same. That glue can do a beautiful repair job, but we'll know it was once in pieces. Experiencing the break changed it. But that doesn't mean we can't perceive this as a positive thing. Our life may or may not look different from the outside, but on the inside, it's going to feel very different. But we can make this change, this difference, count for something. There's so much powerful potential and resilient strength in that something that can make the broken feel a little more whole again. Sure, we can still feel less than whole, less than perfect, but we have the power to perceive this imperfection not as a reminder of how unfair God or fate can be, but as something that allows light to shine through. We can choose to sit under that light and watch as it makes us grow. Now, in order to find that certain something, we have to first give ourselves permission to search for it. When we grieve in a more mindful way, I think that the search can feel a little less desperate, a little less like we're hunting for something. As mindful explorers, we can choose to treat the part of us that is searching a little more kindly, lovingly, patiently, compassionately, without constantly judging it or pressuring it to hurry up and find it. We can choose to forgive those wrong turns, those disappointing leads that can feel like failures, and remind ourselves that sometimes the value of the journey lies not in the finding, but in the searching. And when we can do this, we can help the part of us that's just trying to figure out the rest of our life do that with a little more peace. What helps to piece our life back together is what makes each grieving journey feel so unique. But I do think that what they all have in common is our intention to restore any meaning or purpose that great loss may have eroded or erased from our life. What can put us back together again can consist of time spent with our loved ones, forging new connections with strangers in a support group, at a volunteer community center, new activities that we seek out, finding comforting spiritual or religious practices, moving to a new place, a change of scenery, or that magic glue could end up being that creative part of us, that creativity that lay dormant, waiting to awaken when we most needed it, and find its expression through art, painting, sculpting, writing a book, journaling, sharing the story of our loss on paper can be so cathartic, even if the only person that reads that story is you. And finally, what may help our heart to feel a little more whole again is rediscovering the power of one, who we are alone without the influence and presence of the one we lost. In a lifetime, we can experience the loss of many things more than once. A job, an identity, a relationship, a beloved. And each time we do, we embark on a grieving journey. And in every instance, it's going to look and feel different. We can't possibly know how grief is going to manifest in our body, in our mind, in our life until we're in it. When loss puts us on a journey that none of us want, figuring out where we're going to be tomorrow may not be as useful as realizing that we can't possibly know where grief is going to take us from one hour to the next. The grieving journey, I think, manifests as a minute-by-minute experience. Just when we think we're approaching the end of our journey and we've gotten through the worst of it, a sudden intense bout of longing and love and sorrow and grief can come out of nowhere. There is no predicting its trajectory. Just when we think we've cried our last tear, we can find ourselves grieving some more. We may not know what the next moment will bring until we're in that moment experiencing it. But I think that when we choose to greet the present moment, whatever comes, however it manifests, with compassionate, tender acceptance, this journey can feel far less exhausting, far more productive than wondering what tomorrow will bring. What we encounter at every moment of our grieving journey can change. We may experience hopelessness only to discover that if we allow it to run its course, one day, quite unexpectedly, we can meet hope. We can live a moment of deep unhappiness and awaken to find that we're feeling a little better, a little happier. Our grieving is always in flux. The present moment is always giving us opportunities to create new memories. And I think that these memories can exist in perfect rightness and harmony with the memories of the past. Even as we grieve, we're making new memories. Now, these memories will never replace the memories of that future that we lost. But I don't think that's ever their intention. When we grieve mindfully, we can remind ourselves that we don't have to make comparisons that are going to make those new memories feel like they're competing against the old ones. We don't have to constantly keep judging that new normal and telling it that it will never be good enough. The new can never replace the old, but I do believe that it can add to it in a very good way. Grief can change us, but grief can also change when we learn to make peace with it. It can feel more gentle, softer, as we learn to soften our own attitude towards it. I believe that our journey is about learning to accept that our grieving is a perfectly imperfect thing, and about learning to make peace with the fact that we have to spend whatever is left of our life with loss. Now, this peace may not be able to take away our sadness and longing, but it can do so much to ease and comfort these feelings. I don't know that time heals our grief as much as it changes it, because as we age, our grieving can also change. Time, the years, can change its texture, how it feels in our mind, our body, our heart. It can feel less grasping and overwhelming. With time, our grief may want to remind us more of the good, the funny or wise things our loved ones said or did, and less of the not so good. We may find ourselves ruminating far less over those not so good memories and focusing less on what loss took away and less on those couldas, shouldas that plagued us so much in the beginning, and want us to devote more time, focus more on the good that loss left behind. The passing of time can change our relationship to the person who died. As we get older and life experiences and learning mature us, feelings like anger or resentment that may once have been an important factor in that relationship can become irrelevant as we grow a greater understanding and gratitude for the resources they gave us, which we may not have recognized or appreciated when they lived. Feelings like anger or resentment can fade as we learn to forgive their failures and shortcomings and learn to appreciate what these left behind. Our own resilient ability to give ourselves what they failed to give us. Time can make us so much wiser about keeping the good, keeping the learning, and forgiving, letting go of the rest. So how do we cope with our new reality, with our loss, especially in the beginning? Well, to be honest, I don't know that I like that word, cope, all that much, because to me it implies learning to manage something negative. And I think that the part of us that grieves isn't being negative, it's being vulnerable and allowing ourselves to express that vulnerability is a beautiful thing. I think that the grieving journey is less about coping and more about learning to observe our grieving in a more compassionate, in a kinder way, and learning to connect with that sensation of grief where we feel it in our body, and asking our grief a curious question. What is it that you need? Now, being mindful is about remembering that what our grief needs isn't always what it wants. It may want another glass of wine. It may want a bag of chocolate. It may want another visit to our favorite online store. But is that really what it needs? Sometimes our grief wants to be still. Sometimes it wants us to be active. Your grief may ask you to do something, to go to Italy, to go to church, to volunteer, to enroll in a cooking or pottery class, to write a song. I remember that, my grief once asked me to clean out my closet. Or your grief may ask you to simply be with it in peace, to meditate, to relax and take a nap, or to simply sit with it quietly in your garden. I know that when my grief is feeling lonely, it usually wants me to call my sister. And when it's feeling like it needs a little love, I'll give myself a great big hug. Being able to say that proper farewell to our loved one can bring tremendous peace and closure. Sadly, during the pandemic, far too many people were denied that opportunity. Not being able to be with their loved one in the hospital when they passed can have added a layer of grief to their grieving. When we're not able to be with the one we love during their final moments for whatever reason, well, this can add so much guilt, remorse, regret, and pain to an already painful journey. If life circumstances, poor timing, denied you the opportunity to say a proper goodbye, you can use the magic of your imagination to create one. Remember that what we vividly experience in our imagination can feel very real to our heart, to our mind, to our body. And through the magic, the power of our imagining, we can bring a little peace to our grief, to all our feelings. We can unburden our heart. Now, imagining this moment doesn't change what really happened. We know that. But our subconscious mind, every cell in our body gets a tremendous gift, a chance to experience this beautiful closure. And this can make all the difference. It may not be able to change the past, but it can change how the past feels in our heart. And that negative emotional charge in our body can weaken and even disappear. If you'd like to create a memory of that final goodbye in your heart, find a time and a place when you can be alone, uninterrupted. Get comfortable. Close your eyes and allow your breath to relax your mind, your body, your heart. And think of a special place. This can be a place that's significant because you and your loved one like spending time there. Or it can be a place that you find soothing and beautiful. And then bringing all your senses to life. Fantasize that you're there in this place, taking in all the sights and sounds and smells. Really feel that you're there. And then as vividly as you can, experience that the person you lost magically appears as real as can be. And you're greeting this person and feel the wonder and magic of that encounter. And however that happens in your imagination is good. And then find a spot in this place and settle down to have a nice, relaxing chat. You can talk about whatever you want. And at some point, give yourself permission to unburden your heart, to have that conversation that you always wanted to have, but perhaps never could for whatever reason. And listen as your loved one answers back. A client once did this, and much to her amazement, her beloved pet could talk, and boy, the things that it said. You can create an opportunity to Allow all your thoughts and feelings to express themselves, knowing in your heart that they're being met with profound wisdom, understanding, compassion, and love, and that whatever is said holds great potential for healing and resolution. Now, this conversation may involve a little or a lot of forgiving, saying the words "I'm sorry," or listening as your loved one says these words to you. Forgiveness can bring such remarkable peace, comfort, and healing to our grieving. When you're ready, if you wish, you can end that conversation, that encounter, with a "see you later" instead of a "goodbye." You can take the opportunity to express your love in a physical way and give your loved one a hug. Really feel that hug and feel as your loved one hugs you back. And then when the time is right, allow your loved one to return to wherever it is that he or she came from. When you're ready, open your eyes. Give yourself a few minutes to ground your senses, your mind, your body in the present moment. And allow every cell in your body to process the peace and blessing of that farewell. My mother was never able to feel truly happy and at peace when she lived. So I tried to honor her memory by feeling the happiness and peace she never could. Sometimes I'll look for something that can bring a little calm, a little wellness, a little happiness to my heart. And I'll do this on purpose with the intention of being able to say, "Mom, this moment is for you." I think that when we purposely create, good, loving, happy moments and dedicate them to those who are no longer with us, we find a wonderful way to stay connected to them. What better way to honor the goodness, happiness, and love they gave us, or to honor our potential to learn to give ourselves what they never knew how to give us or to give themselves. The part of us that misses our beloved will always need to express that longing. But I think that the missing can hurt a lot less if we learn to wrap it in lots of gratitude. When I recall those good memories and miss my mom, it feels less like I'm grieving and more like I'm celebrating that goodness, celebrating the fact that despite the many challenges in our relationship, there's so much that I miss. In a sense, the missing feels good because it keeps reminding me of all the great moments we shared. We don't miss the bad things. We only miss the good things. So I think that the more we miss someone, the more proof we have that our life was and continues to be blessed with so much abundance. When we miss them and enjoy those memories, feel that goodness, we can give that thankfulness and appreciation that we feel permission to make us a little happy. Our loved ones may no longer be physically present in our life. But I think we know that our love, our thoughts, our memories, keep them alive in our hearts, in our minds. And despite the physical absence, we can still feel their wonderful presence. When we yearn for those loved ones that have passed away, we can transform some of that missing into gratitude. Think of it this way. How blessed are we that we once had something so precious that we are now feeling its loss. The love that makes us long for them can also remind us how full our heart is to know that it is twice blessed by the love that we have for them and the love that they will always have for us, because this love will always be. Gratitude can comfort and ease and feel so healing to our grief, which is why I came up with the gratitude meditation to help clients shift their focus from loss to abundance. If you'd like to shift your focus from what you lost to being grateful for what you have, you can try this very simple meditation. It can last for a few minutes, however long is up to you. So find a place where you can be alone, uninterrupted, get comfortable, close your eyes, and allow your breath to relax you. And just imagine the faces of your loved ones and really feel their presence in your heart. Really flow that appreciation and gratitude for everything they gave you, for whatever it was that made them so special to you. You can recall one or two memories of time spent together and just feel the gratitude for those memories, for those moments. You can, flow gratitude for the teaching that they leave behind, because sometimes our greatest teachers and the greatest learning comes not from those who did everything right, but from those who didn't. They leave behind an important legacy, an intense desire in us to do better, to learn from their mistakes and failures. So what you can do is take a nice, long inhalation and then think or silently mouth the word thank, and then take a nice, long out breath. And as you do, think or mouth the word you. So it becomes thank you. And really repeat this thank you and feel it. Really feel that gratitude. And what you want to do, the idea, is to flow as much gratitude as you can and make this feeling feel even more intense and powerful than that feeling of loss, than that feeling of grief and all those feelings that are inside your grief. You can send that thank you, of course, to the loved ones who have passed, but you can also send that thank you to those that remain, for everything in your life that you haven't lost, for all the little things that continue to bring you wellness and security. And if you find that your thoughts wander, just bring your attention back to your breath, to that thank you, and refocus your thoughts so that you're feeling that gratitude. Really, there is no wrong way to do this meditation. The idea is just to help you to ground yourself, your mind, your body, your heart in that emotional abundance and all of your blessings. Sadly, when we're trying to comfort someone we care about who's grieving, our best intentions may not always be enough and can in fact backfire. The more that I cared for someone, the more desperately I tried to cheer them up. And the more I tried, the less I succeeded, until I understood that sometimes less is more. We can comfort them in silence. Our body language can say far more than awkward words ever could. Extending a hand, offering a hug, offering a loving, sympathetic smile, a kind gesture, that home-cooked meal. All of these can convey, I'm here for you if you need me. I remember that I used to talk and say things like, time is a great healer, you'll get through this, loss can make you stronger. There was nothing wrong with saying these things, and in fact, they may all be true, except that the moment when we say them may not be the moment when that person wants to hear them. I think that by offering our mindful, unconditional presence, we can comfort someone far more than trying to make them feel better. Because, well, that's not always possible or realistic. Learning to be there for someone who's grieving can become a little more doable when we understand that no one word or phrase or deed is going to make them feel better every time. Our love and support can make them feel comforted and less alone, except when they don't. Accepting those moments with wise understanding is about recognizing that it's no one's fault. Sometimes our grief and suffering don't want the comfort of others. They just want to be left alone. It's so difficult to witness the grief and suffering of someone we care about without wanting to take some of it away so that they carry less. But no matter how much we want to take away the pain they feel, we can't. Just as we can't always take away the pain of our grief, no matter how much we may want to. I think that when we learn to allow them to be with their pain and grief, to process it in their own way, however that looks like, we learn to do the same for ourselves, to give ourselves the space to work through our grief in our own way. As a friend, as a family member, we may not always get it right and will probably get it wrong, but our constant and humble efforts to offer our imperfect affection, our imperfect presence, and stay connected over a meal, over Facebook, over FaceTime, can let those we care about who are grieving feel that they may feel alone, but they're not alone. Learning to give that same care, compassion, and attention we give others to ourselves can feel challenging when we believe that they need it more than we do, and that somehow if we give ourselves these things, they'll be the recipient of less. Prioritizing our grief can feel irresponsible and selfish when we feel that it's more important to attend to the grief of others. But if our own grief is left waiting, unsupported, unattended, until we have the time and energy to take care of it, the part of us that grieves may feel even more alone, aggrieved, and ignored. I think that an important part of this journey is about realizing that we need our own love and support in every phase of this journey, and that it's important to let others know that we're hurting and that we deserve to tend to our hurts as well. Sometimes we can get so caught up in our grief that we forget that others are dealing with their grief and pain as well. So grieving in a mindful way is also about remembering that our grieving journey is not more important or less important than anyone else's. Over a long period of time, our body can get so used to the grieving that it may get to the point where the grieving may not know how or even want to stop grieving, despite our conscious desire to do so. So on this journey, it's a good idea to keep checking in with ourselves, to keep asking, does my grieving need help? Do I need help? When loss drives us to indulge in thinking and behaviors that are depleting our health, negatively affecting it, finding a support group, a trusted psychologist or therapist that specializes in grief counseling may be the choice that we need to make. To say that the grieving journey is tough is an understatement. We may rail against whatever put us on it, but once we're in it, we might as well learn from it. My work has taught me in the potential of every journey, no matter how painful it is, to heal something, to teach us something that can bring us back to ourselves in a greater state of wholeness. When we can learn to allow our grief to visit, to be with it mindfully, we can welcome it, as the poet Rumi used to say, as a guide from beyond. It is my sincerest wish that one day you wake up and realize that the hole in your heart that loss left behind is filled with so much peace, love, and gratitude for all the blessings and goodness your loved one left behind inside of you. Thank you so much for listening to my thoughts on grief and grieving. If you'd like to share your story, if you have any questions or comments, please send me an email. I'd love to hear from you.